Thank you to all my viewers who went to carnivorecrisps.com and made their first order using my promo code Dante and getting 10% off your order because they are now officially sponsoring my videos. If you haven't tried them, go there now. And also a big thanks to those of you who went to redmond.life to get 10% off your order there. Redmond salt is my salt of choice for all my food. If you want the best, go there now. And don't forget to use my promo code Dante to get 10% off your order. Hi, I'm Dante Ferrigno, and this is the second special video in a series that's dealing with grass-fed beef. In the first video, we spoke with Miles Moore of Big Mo's Cattle down in Dixie, Georgia. And in this video, we're going to be speaking again with Miles, but also with Jeff Disken of Johnston Meat Processing of Monticello, Florida. We're going to be discussing the cut order for a full beef that I ordered when I spoke with Miles last month. I'm hoping that this will give you some illumination into the concept of buying local beef so that you would have a clearer picture of what it's like to order your own steer, to buy local, to be able to support your local community, but also to be able to support your own health with better quality meats. Enjoy.
Jeff, this is the face you don't recognize on this screen is Dante. He has been doing the lion diet where he basically eats pretty much just meat from ruminant animals. Is that correct, Dante?
That's correct. So a lot of beef.
A lot of beef. And so he has purchased a cow from us and he came out and took a look at our operation. And so he's in the spot now where he needs to be able to give you a cut order because the animal's going to show up at your place next Monday. So he needs to be able to give a cut order to you. And so he thought, well, if he could video document this so he could show his people that watch YouTube, he can learn and he can also pass that on to those that are trying to learn this process. And you can kind of talk him through this. And he doesn't know what questions, he's got some questions, but he may not even know all the questions to ask today.
I was going to say, we can go through all that. One thing I didn't do is grab a cut sheet. Let me step over here and grab a cut sheet.
All right,
okay.
That'll be fine.
And just to let you know, Jeff, what we're really trying to do here is most of my viewers are carnivore dieters. They may not be lion dieters. They may just be other, they'll eat any meat. And my diet, I only eat ruminant meats, but I have a pretty good following of folks who are interested in that. And I'm trying to encourage folks to buy local beef for several reasons, but one of the biggest ones being their health purposes. And especially if you can get grass-fed, grass-finished beef like Miles makes over at Big Mo's, it's an exciting opportunity for folks to get some of the best quality beef available and support the local beef manufacturers and processors like yourself. And this will remove the fear that they have of trying this for the first time or even searching for one and then knowing what to do, because most people don't want to go into any situation feeling like they don't have any knowledge of what they're doing. And this, I think, will remove some of the darkness in their minds of what it takes to get your own cow ordered or half cow, half beef, full beef, and then get it cut and processed and really get an idea also for what they're going to be spending in the end. And if it's really worth the investment, or if it's more expensive or less expensive. I mean, I think it's going to break down to be as much as I've been spending already and still get a much finer quality piece of beef.
Well, I think actually you'll find that it actually would be cheaper overall. Your higher end cuts, you'll be a lot less on your cost. And then of course on your grind, the less of them, it evens out. So they might be a little bit more, but still all in all, it'll be a cheaper venture than just going down to the store and buying a piece at a time.
Okay. Well, if you'd like, Miles was telling me a little bit about your history as a butcher there. If you want to kind of give us a little background on yourself, that would be great.
Well, I started out right at the end of 1973, going into 74, started a small packing house up in East Central Illinois. The people that taught me how to cut, the youngest man I worked with and was mostly my mentor, he was 67 when I met him, and I was just 18, I'm 67 now myself. I learned old school. I mean, I learned from the fellows. They all started up in Chicago in the stockyards back in the 20s. I think I finally got to where I can keep my knife sharp as they did. But I've traveled all over the country. Cutting meat has been turned out to be a good thing for me. I've lived in San Antonio. I worked at this chain of grocery stores there in San Antonio and a small packing house south of San Antonio in Devine, Texas. That was all in the early 80s. I worked in Orlando for a number of years in the late 80s. I opened my own store up, had it for 9 years up in Tennessee, and then I came back down to Florida. I've ran markets in Honolulu, Hilo, out in Los Angeles. I've kind of traveled around a good bit, but all in all, I've learned a lot of things from a lot of different meat cutters. So there's not too many things that anybody's going to ask me that I don't know about as far as cutting up meat.
Well, that's fantastic, because the extent of my knowledge is the ribeyes taste better and the New York strips taste better, but I'm just now beginning to learn even where they are in the cow and how you can't, like Miles taught me about how you can't order a bunch of porterhouses and expect to get sirloins and filet mignon as well. I guess those are the two that make up a porterhouse. And it makes it hard to order cuts of beef when you really don't know what you're asking somebody to do, except that you want certain types. So, I know kind of what I want to have, but what would be a suggestion you would offer to somebody who's never ordered a full cow or a half cow to be processed like this to make their order?
Well, first off, I'm going to ask about your steaks. How thick do you like your steaks cut? And then, do you want boneless cuts or do you want the bone-in cuts? All those have a little bit of bearing in different cuts, but I mean, that's your basis. Now on your roast, some people don't cook roast. If you don't want to use the roast that way, I mean, if you do stew, you can dice it up for stew meat. Otherwise, everything ends up in ground beef, whatever you don't want. And your scraps, basically meaning, wedge cuts, things you can't make a steak or a roast out of, then go with your trimmings for grinds. So those are just the basic starting questions. And then we can just go through the each cut, each section of the animal and determine what you do want or do not want. I usually start out, just kind of following our cutting instructions. And I start out with the rib. Do you want boneless ribeyes, or we cap it out and we leave just a little bit of the bone on it? And, it's called a rib steak. So that'd be your first choice as to which would you prefer, bone-in or boneless.
Now, as a consumer, most of the time when I've seen bone-in or boneless ribeye, for instance, I noticed that they a lot of times put the bone-in ribeye on sale. I assumed it was because you're getting weight of the bone added to it. So it's already, you're paying a little extra for something that a lot of people don't even do anything with. A lot of times they throw their bones away or they give them to their animals. Folks on this diet many times will turn them into bone broth and eat the marrow and everything else. So what would be the benefit of somebody having the bone in as opposed to bone out?
Well, some people feel that cooking the bone with the meat adds to the flavor, gives you a little bit different flavor. I myself, I don't see a great deal of difference in the flavor with the bone on it. And just like you said, a lot of people are looking at it. So, well, if you're buying, I'm paying for that bone that I'm not going to eat. A lot of it just comes down to a personal preference. As far as ribeyes, I usually go boneless myself. That little bit of bone that is only on a few of the steaks, because as you're cutting, the bones have a separation between them. So you still end up with just a ribeye. About half of them have a little bone on them. Half of them are just going to be a ribeye anyway.
Some people like the presentation, Dante, of the bone on the rib. That's why a lot of restaurants will sometimes give you that bone. And you've heard of the tomahawk steak.
A cowboy cut ribeye type of
cowboy, yeah, those big old things, they got that big old bone on there. It's presentation. So,
well, what if you get all or boneless as much as possible? Do you still get to keep the bones?
If you like.
Okay.
That is one of the questions on there. We have soup bones marked on there. That's more you keeping marrow bones. But we do have some folks that ask to keep all the bones.
Does it cost more to keep the bone in or out?
No. The fees, our processing fees are the same, whether you have bone in or bone out. It doesn't matter. That's not a criteria of the pricing. You get it your way is basically what it comes down to.
All right. So it's about the same no matter how you have it cut then.
Right. The only difference you would see if you did not want your bones and all is when you look at your ratio of take-home product compared to your hanging weight, then, the less bone that you take, if we're going to throw it away, that goes along with any fat that's not going to be used. So, your cutout percentage would be less.
So if you take the bone out, you get less fat with the meat then?
Well, you're trimming both in most cases. You're trimming off some of the outer bark, the fat, and then you take the bones out. So there's a loss factor. And that's all you're looking at there is a loss percentage.
It's kind of important for a lot of carnivore dieters because fat is a big part of our diet. We want to add fat. And I think if leaving the bone in gives you more fat to consume in the steak that you cook, it might be beneficial for folks to have the bone in.
The bone and the fat are not married. It doesn't work that way. I mean,
okay.
You either want the bones or the fat part of it is just a trim situation. And in what you're saying there, if you want that, I mean, we're more than likely, we probably would not take hardly any fat away from it.
Okay, good.
We judge our grinds. Most folks that are coming in, they're looking for leaner cuts and leaner grinds. You're on the other end of the spectrum on that.
I'm the opposite of everybody.
Right. Well, and that's something that the trimmings, as we're processing the animal, we're gauging that to meet the specification of whatever the customer wants. If you want a 70-30 grind or 80-20, or some folks want them real lean, like a 85 plus, we just gauge that as we're doing our boning and trimming and try to get as close as we can to what you like.
Well, if I was placing an order, even when I look at the sheet, one of the things that comes to mind is I don't know what some of them even are as far as the cuts, like shoulder steak. I don't know how I would cook that. Skirt steak, I don't know what I would do with that. Delmonico, it's just a blank spot in my mind. I've had a Delmonico steak before, but it was just to taste and see what Delmonico tasted like, but I don't know where it comes from or what part of the animal it is. And there's probably a few other ones that I wouldn't know what to do with because I'm not an expert at cooking. I didn't do a lot of cooking before this diet, but ever since I started eating this way, I've done all the cooking. So that's made a big difference. But if I were to order something, I would probably tell you, I want to get as many steaks as I can. And then I want to take the organs as much as I can, about a 90-10 split added to the burger, or as much of the burger as I can, so I can have what are called warrior burgers, according to Miles. I assume you're familiar with that term as well?
I am. Your organs, adding your organs is not a problem. You're looking at the heart, the tongue, the tail. Of course, the tail, there's really hardly any meat to get off of that. But as far as the liver and the heart and the tongue, that's not a problem adding that. If you want the kidneys, we can save those and get those in there too. A lot of these cuts, as you mentioned, like the Delmonico things, a lot of them are just repetitive names for the same cut. I mean, a ribeye.
Be confusing.
Yeah, a ribeye, Delmonico is just a fancy name for a ribeye. I mean, the small nuance that would comprise the difference was basically like leaving a little tail on it. The Delmonico restaurant years ago, they wanted a bigger steak to cover the plate, so they left the tail on a ribeye because basically it was always a ribeye roll. There was no tail. It's just that circle of eye. So they left the tail on. They called it Delmonico after the restaurant. It's much the same cut.
Okay.
Rib roast, instead of cutting it into steaks, you leave it whole, you cut it as a roast. And then that's your prime rib. Prime rib's a cooking term in that sense. It's not the grade of the beef. It's just a cooking term for a rib roast. You take the whole rib and you roast it just like you would any other roast, and then you slice it and serve it after the fact. And you mentioned, your shoulder steak, chuck steak. Well, that's all out of your shoulder muscles, and that's you either do them as roast, which most people do. Some people want to cut some of them a little thinner and steak. You cook them like a steak. It's not necessarily going to be very tender, but you can use it as a steak. So you're just cutting down on one item and adding to it in another area.
If I placed an order or I told you that I wanted to get as many steaks as possible, I want the steaks to be as tender as possible, and then the rest of it to be done into burger, would that be a fairly easy cut order?
Oh, that'd be very easy, because that just means a lot of boning for us.
Yeah, let me add in something here for you, Dante, just to clarify. On a cow, the more used the muscle is, the different way you would cook it in order to make it palatable to your liking. So when he's talking about shoulder steaks, it is a shoulder roast that's cut in. It's like a chuck roast cut in thinner. Now, as a chuck roast that you want to cook all day slow, it's just as tender and delicious as it could possibly be.
Yeah.
But if you were to tell him that I want the the most tender steaks as steaks. And then let's talk about the roasts that are still tender. You just cook them differently.
Right.
If you're looking for something you could just put in your air fryer, then that's a different way of doing it. Because
Understood.
all of those roasts, you have to cook differently to make them the way typically people would cook a Sunday afternoon roast. You know, you come home from church and you have a roast. Well, that's not cooked in your air fryer.
Exactly.
Could be, but that's why where we generally have people, we try to tell people, get the chuck roast, get your brisket roasts, get those roasts that we know are going to be fabulous. And then part of that is you saying to yourself, how much burger do I really want? If you want to lessen the burger, there's two ways to look at this: maximize my steak and lessen the burger. Then you're going to get these other cuts that need to be braised in your cooking process.
Okay, and that makes sense because I would like to have some of the roast, because I do like to roast the chuck steak, and it does come out very tender. So I don't want to lose the chuck steaks like that either. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Well, to go a step farther with what was just mentioned, a steer pushes himself everywhere he goes. The front legs just keep his head off the ground. That's why your ribeyes, your chuck roasts and shoulders and all that, they cook down and the muscle separates because it's not that well used muscle.
Right.
When you look at your hindquarters, your back legs, that's where you get your round steak, your rump roast, your top round London broils, and you even see it in your strip steaks. It's a grainier texture because those muscles are what he uses every day to move himself around and push him along. So it's a leaner muscle. You don't see much marbling in it. And when you cook it, it doesn't tend to shred and fall apart. A rump roast, you go in places up there and they have Italian roast beef. Well, it's a roast, they're using that rump roast and bottom round roast. You cook it, but then once you cook it, it tends to be a drier roast, but you cook it, then you slice it, and they throw it all back into their juice, and then they just tong it out and throw it on an old crusty bun to soak up the juice, so you don't have a dry roast.
Yeah. Okay.
Slice very thin.
Correct.
All right. Well, let's see how it would come out as far as what would be the end result here if I said I wanted my steaks to be about 1.25 inches, and I wanted to have maximize my steaks, minimize the burger, use as much organ meat as you can in the burger to make warrior burgers. And I do want to try to keep those roasts that are good for slow cooking.
Well, that'd work out great. I mean, like I say, that the round, we'd be able to maximize more use of the fat that the animal has if you don't use the round roasts and stuff. If you're going to take the leaner roasts and use them in your grind, we can maximize more of what you're going to take home.
Okay. That sounds good.
I'm making notes as we was talking there.
Okay.
Now the skirt steak, that is what you get when you go to a Mexican restaurant and they're making fajitas and different things. You'll see some of that used there. Like if you go have carne asada, my family loves it on the grill, but it's typically marinated and just cooked on the grill. Jeff, what do you think about the skirt steak?
Well, it's a fine piece. Not a lot of people really know how to cook it, but you're right. I mean, that's the main use on the skirt steak, is for doing something like a fajita. The flank steak has the same texture. They're single muscles in the animal, and it's a very coarse grained muscle. So, braising it like that and seasoning it up and slicing it thin makes it a good piece.
Well, that does sound good. I do like the flank steak and fajita. That's what I've usually used when I made fajitas in the past. I mean, you're on an all meat diet. Anything you can do to add some variety is helpful. So if you've got some different cuts of meat and different ways of cutting them, they're welcome to folks who diet like this.
Well, going back into the round, your knuckle, which is your sirloin, they call it it's the bottom sirloin, actually. It makes a nice roast. It's still tender, but it is lean. A lot of folks anymore, what we do with it, we dice it up a little smaller and make use them with stew meat. It makes a real nice stew meat. So anything you want to use stew meat in, how does rice fit in this diet? You don't use the rice, right? Yeah. So
Not at all.
Hal usually always says tips and rice, but it makes it's a tender enough piece out of the round that you can use it for like stews or things like that.
Okay. Well, maybe you should get a record of this type of cut and call it the Lion Diet cut. So when folks call you to get some orders.
Well, we might be doing that. We might have to put up if you want a line cut, here it is.
There you go.
And the other thing is that the ribs, Jeff, I was telling him how much my family absolutely loves the short ribs, the beef ribs. They're nice and fatty. They're just so easy to pop in the oven and slow cook for 3 or 4 hours. Just put some tin foil over it, a little seasoning on it, pop them in there, and they just fall off the bone. It renders down that fat that's in there, and it's just absolutely delicious. So I love those. What's your thought on those, Jeff?
Oh, I'm a big short rib fan myself. I tend to be a little lazier. I just throw them in a crock pot, put a little sauce in there, and add some other seasonings and cook them that way. But yeah, it falls apart. I mean, it shreds just like your chuck, because you're still in the front quarter section right there. Yeah, they make an excellent. We usually cut the first 3, maybe 4 ribs. It gives you your better cuts for the short ribs.
Yeah.
And the other end works out great for his going with the fatter grind. Then we can just put all that right in the grind.
You had mentioned the oxtail, and like he was saying, there's not a tremendous amount of meat in that oxtail. But what we use the oxtail pieces for is sometimes we just cook them like a roast, and we will actually have oxtail. Just eat that. But you can take those pieces, because it's going to be like a hockey puck. That's what it's going to look like when you get it. And that is tremendous to throw into something to season it, because the marrow is in there, the fat is in there, the gelatin is in there. And if you've got something that like the crock pot he's talking about, throw a couple of those in there and cook them, with there, so that you get that marrow and stuff in there. The flavor of that is just, it's making me hungry right now just talking about it. But the flavor of that is tremendous.
I grew up on it. My mom always called it oxtail soup, which kind of like was vegetable soup.
Man, that's good
she always
stuff.
bought oxtail and threw in it.
That is delicious.
Something I grew up on.
Yeah,
but,
good stuff.
We sell a tremendous amount of oxtail here at the store. I mean, it's surprising how much we go through. And talking to most of them, usually I'll ask them, and there's some of them that they put it on the grill and toss it up with something and just grill them, and then sit there and chew on them. So
I've never tried that. Never tried it.
Yeah, it worked out pretty good.
So what would happen with the oxtail in a cut like I am asking for? Normally go into the burger?
Yeah, we can get what meat we could get off of it and put it in the burger.
And then the bone and the marrow that's in there is
be for your soup bones. You can leave it in for your, if you want, we talked about soup bones and doing the broth. So that'd be something you'd add in with that.
okay. And he had also, Miles had also told me about having like the femur bones and split them down the middle and then roast that marrow in there.
Yeah, we have more calls for that now than we did in the past. Usually most people are just wanting to do a broth, but yeah, we'll take and cut it. You'll end up with about a 6 or 8 inch piece and split it down the middle, and that exposes all the marrow, and then you put it in there and season it, roast that up, and then you can eat the marrow out of it.
Well, I've been looking forward to trying that, so I want to make sure I get that involved in my cut.
Kind of like beefy butter.
Yep.
Normally we spread it on bread. You're not going to be able to do that. So.
Well, going back to yesteryear, my mom bought a lot of round steak because it was always cheap. But as you remember, everything was bone in years ago, and always had the round bone, which is the femur bone, still in it. And when they cook it up, and it was always a fight to get the bone, because to get the marrow out of the bone, because whenever you cook it up, it turns to like jelly in there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, not only is it good, like Miles says, but it's just loaded with nutrients.
Correct.
It is.
So, and also Miles had mentioned to me about how many I want in each pack. I assume not using as many vacuum packed sealed pieces of material would keep some of the costs down.
Well, not really, because that's kind of an all part of the process. We just do it by the weight. So as a rule, we pack two steaks to a package. Of course, all your roasts are individual. We don't make a big package of anything. Stew meat, things like that. We do 1 pound to 1.5 pounds. And if there's some folks that maybe it's just 2 folks and they don't want it that way, we can do one steak to a package. We can do 1 pound of this to a package, like on the grinds, 1 pound pack, as opposed normally we run out about 1.5 pounds as our standard. But we can go either way. We can go more, we can go less.
About 2 pounds, pound and a half actually would be good. A lot of times when I buy a 2-pound pack of meat, and my wife has been joining me on this, it's a little too much meat for both of us to eat without pushing ourselves. So a pound and a half sounds pretty good to a pack.
I'm one that anything calls for a pound. I want at least a pound and a half. I'm like you. I might not be on the diet, but when I want some meat, I want some meat. I've always been bigger is better.
Now, Jeff, on the brisket, under that scenario, would you take, since he's getting a whole animal, you know, a lot of times we split that brisket in half. One half goes to one side and the other half goes to the other customer. Since he's getting a whole one, would you split that brisket into four brisket roasts?
Well, it could, depending on the size. Most time you're going to look at probably about might as well say on an average, maybe an 8-pound roast. Thinking back to the other that I've cut for you. So yeah, if they didn't have a need for that large of a roast, if they didn't want to have a party and cook up the whole brisket, well, certainly we could cut it in half.
Okay.
Well, heck, I cooked up a whole brisket and finished it off in a couple of weeks. So,
well, yeah, I take it you're like me. I cook a big amount, and every night I'll eat on it until it's gone, and then I go to something different. My wife has never understood that about me, that I could eat the same thing every day. She's got to have something.
That's one of the hard things sometimes about this diet is that anything with humans, if it's the same thing over and over, it can get monotonous. But it's like I tell my viewers, the one thing that's not monotonous is not feeling as bad as I did before. So if I can go through the monotony of eating the same delicious beef all the time, then I don't have to deal with all the health issues and so many other things that come from being on a diet like this. And the more people that are eating this way, the better it's going to be for folks like you.
Years past, especially when I was in Orlando, I was in my early 30s, bachelor. Every night I ate a steak, I had some vegetables, and that was pretty much what my meals consisted. My diet was probably 99.9% red meat back when everybody was saying you shouldn't eat all that red meat. I weighed 180 pounds. I couldn't gain weight. I was healthy as a horse.
Yeah. Well, I grew up believing all that stuff about low fat and no fat and not eating red meat. And I tried dieting with salads and fruits and all kind of things. And it was a struggle. Mostly I just had to work out all the time just to even stay anywhere close to not being well overweight. And I ultimately ended up just being well overweight in the end, no matter how much I tried. But as soon as I switched to this diet, I only started in January of this year. And I've lost about 75 pounds of fat, and I've gained about 20 pounds of muscle, it feels like, because I've had some struggles where it goes back and forth, but I can see the muscle coming on, and I'm not really having to work all that hard to do it. So
congratulations.
This is a good human diet, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. I've always been a meat eater and always professed that that's what it was meant to be.
So what's the end result with what we've discussed about how this would be cut? Is there any other questions you would have based on what we talked about, that I'd want to have the brisket, that I want to get as many steaks as possible at 1.5 inch cut? I want the roasts that I can slow cook and get that tender flavor out of those as well. And then have as much of whatever's left over into hamburger meat with the organs. Is there anything I'm leaving out, either Miles or Jeff?
One question I have as far as on it, in the short loin, would you want the bone-in T-bones where you have the fillet on one side and the strip on the other, or would you want it boneless where New York strip and then fillets?
I think I would want boneless because I like the New York strips by themselves.
Yeah. All right. We've basically covered everything as far as the cuts and the way you want them. And the rest of it, you want to all your fat into your grinds. You want more of a 50 to 60% grind.
Yeah, I want the full fat.
But yeah, that covers it. That gives me a clear picture of what you want out of your animal. And it's nothing that we wouldn't be able to achieve.
Fantastic.
Now, as far as the tongue goes, you want the tongue as a separate piece you're going to cook, Dante?
I had thought about that. I've never done it before, but I remember you telling me about how tender and delicious it is.
What I typically do is boil it for about 45 minutes to an hour, and then you pull it out, and what'll happen is the outside skin of it, you can just peel off like you're peeling an onion.
Right.
You take that very tender meat, and you can cut it up to thin pieces. A lot of people have tongue sandwiches, but you're not going to have a sandwich, but You can take that piece of tongue then and you can put it in your air fryer and put a little crust on it with some salt. It'll be delicious. But it's a very tender piece of meat.
Well, I'll get it whole then so that I can try it out that way. I've been looking forward to trying that ever since you mentioned it.
Well, you wouldn't be disappointed.
Well, we'll have that documented as well when that time comes. So it's going to be a good learning experience for anybody who's never tried it. And I assume there's a lot of people who have never tried it.
That's true. A lot of people can't get over the thought of what it is. They don't ever try it just because of what it is.
Yeah.
I always say, if you don't want it because it was in a cow's mouth, why are you eating eggs?
There you go.
Now, the other thing is that, Dante, as far as some of the knuckles where you have a lot of good collagen and that sort of thing, saving some of those knuckles so that you can make beef broth, you know, you can use them in soups and that sort of thing. He'll need to know that if you want to save some of that.
Yeah, anything I can do to get more collagen is welcome, because I know most people throw that away, but we want to eat as much of it as we can because it's good for your skin. It's good for a number of things, but it's something.
What they can also do in the butchering process, if they know that what you're going to do with this, they don't have to trim those down quite as tight. You know, they can leave a little bit of meat, you know, on them, and you're going to, because they know what you're going to do with them. You know, you're going to braise them or roast them or, you know, make a soup with them, you know, whatever you want to do. But those, you know, those knuckles are awfully good for that.
What do you suggest to do with the knuckles if you're just eating the meat only and the collagen? I mean, you're not going to eat it with anything else.
Make bone broth with them.
Make bone broth.
A meaty bone broth, yeah.
Okay.
You get all that collagen and everything, you know, in you.
Yeah, whatever you would normally throw out on those knuckles, we'll just put them all together so I can put them in my bone bag and be ready to make some bone broth.
Yeah.
Well, I already marked, as we talked earlier when we talked about the marrow bone, but I already had those marked.
Okay.
I'll slice them about 3/4, maybe an inch thick, slice them up that way, and we put them in, you know, multiple packages. We don't make one big package. You'll have numerous packages that'll have a couple slices of the knuckle bones in there.
Okay. What's our hanging weight, or do we even know? We won't know until it gets there, will we?
Don't know.
Correct. We have to wait till the animal gets here and we get it hanging in the cooler, and then we'll know our weights, what we're looking at.
So just to recover that, Miles, you had told me that it's going to hang for about 3 weeks, and the delivery is next week?
Yeah, delivery's next week, and it'll hang for 3 weeks, and then they'll cut it up after that 3 weeks, and then they need a few days for it to be frozen, and then they will package it. It'll come with our Millbrook label on it, and it'll have what the cut is, it'll have the weight on it, and it'll come in wax boxes. And you can just drive down to Johnston's store. You just load those wax boxes in your back of your vehicle and take them home to your freezer, and they'll stay. It's hard frozen when you pick it up in those cryovac packages.
Perfect.
And so you'll be able to make it home with those things. I even have people that will come 3 hours or more away. And when they do that, what they do is they bring a sleeping bag, and they can slide the boxes in a sleeping bag, or they put blankets around it, and they'll go 3 or 4 hours from home in the back seat of their car, and they'll say it's just solid frozen when they get home. So you don't need to bring a cooler and repack out the boxes into a cooler. You don't need to do that. Just take those wax boxes, load them in your car, and take them straight home, and they'll be fine.
Perfect. Well, I'll be documenting the pickups process as well, so we can see how all that looks, and then I'll be documenting the eating process. So we're going to get a good look at this when it's all said and done. So I'm talking about 5 weeks from today then, roughly.
Well, yeah, next week, 3 weeks would be the second week of September.
Right.
Somewhere around the 9th, depending on what day he drops them cows off.
All right, so right about a month from now, because today's the 10th.
Correct.
All right, is there anything I've missed?
No,
I
sir.
don't think so. I think you pretty well got it. Jeff, can you think of anything?
Oh, we covered everything as far as cutting the animal, and all the other piece is just the enjoyment of it.
Well, I'm looking forward to that. You can rest assured. All right, well, I guess that'll conclude this meeting, and I appreciate you, Jeff and Miles, for joining me today for this, because I know it was something unusual for both of y'all, but I also hope that it helps local farmers and processors like yourselves get a little bit more attention, so that folks will not only be supporting their local community, but also supporting their own health.
Sounds good. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Y'all have a great day.
All right, bye-bye.
Is there anything I'm leaving out, either Miles or Jeff?
No,
I get confused because I know Miles's first name is Jeff also. Sorry.
Yeah.
I don't even know how to end the meeting. Let me see here. There it is.